Hello there, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about two films from John Landis from the 80s, Spies Like Us and Three Amigos. This is my series I haven't done for a bit called Films from Childhood Memory or Teenage Memory. Just basically films from the late 70s to basically about 1990 that I saw through a child or teenage person's eyes, and they were kind of formative in some ways, and probably more than I thought they were at the time. So now I can look back on it and say, yeah, that actually was more informed me more than I thought. Or that was more important to me than I thought at the time. At the time I just watched them film thinking, oh, these are good fun. And then you realise you've watched them countless times, and it's like, there is something there that's actually stuck in your head. So I'm going to do the two John Landis films from the mid-80s that kind of did that. Now, I'm very a Landis fan. Like, I love Animal House and Blues Brothers and Trading Places. Trading Places was one of the films that was always on, always talked about in the schoolyard. Because Eddie Murphy was big at the time. And then Landis did Into the Night, which I haven't watched for a while, but I remember really enjoying it. But that was a film that came and went for his career. Like, it didn't do very well, and it was like, okay, I stuck to comedies now. So if it had done better, he might have actually been able to stretch out and do other films. But instead, his thriller thing was kind of like, no, we're not going to go in this direction with you anymore, so you're going to do some more comedies. So this happened after his big thing with the Twilight Zone, when the helicopter crashed and killed Vic Moore and two children. So when he was making, when he was in post-production of Three Amigos, it was actually during his trial. So he's going to trial during the day and coming back at night and actually doing post-production of the film and dealing with studio executives at the time. So it was quite a stressful time for him. Now, it's one of those things with Landis' career. There's lots of reasons why it kind of had a peak early and then kind of fell away slowly. I mean, the one big thing is, for lots of people in comedy, that's the kind of career trajectory. You have a bit where you're really fresh and really new, and everything you're doing seems really interesting. If you look at Eddie Murphy's career, it's the same thing. Steve Martin had an early bust, and then he kind of, pretty much from the early 90s, he was either, some good films, some terrible films, and they just kind of went that way. And even from the past, like, even like comedy duos, even for the 30s and 40s, you'd have a good little run, and then it would be, you've done the act, basically, and people are like, well, what else do you have? And so for comedy, tends to do not have long legs unless you've got someone who's really talented and have always reinvented themselves. The problem in Hollywood is they don't want you to reinvent yourself. They want you to do the same thing again and again, which is a thing with comedians when they have to try and keep on reinventing to make it fresh. And then they're getting paid to do the same thing again and again. It basically means as their inspiration kind of starts to dry up. Which is what I kind of talked about a little bit with Beverly Hills Cop trilogy a week or two ago, which Landis did the third one of, where it was obvious Murphy was getting more and more bored with the character and by his persona. And he went away and actually started doing films with lots of latex on him, so he didn't have to be himself in films. But a lot of people in comedy have to basically do the same thing again and again. There's only so many good jokes you've got in a certain type of comedy, and so basically you have to try and adjust slightly and slowly adjust to a different type of thing and keep on moving around to try and keep it fresh. Now, Landis went from the early 80s, which was much rougher, like Animal House and Trading Places was much rougher humour, to the mid-80s, which was pure Reaganite era. And so Landis' approach there was, because he had a satirical point of view, was to make it big and silly, because Reagan era was big and silly. But the unfortunate thing is, it kind of carried with him into his instinct, so he went big and silly. Because he went big and silly in Blues Brothers, but he still had the backup of, it was taking place in Chicago, and Chicago was a rough place. As they get older, this became his studio kind of style, is bigger and sillier. And again, it's because you can only do this so often before it starts to become stale. And that's the kind of thing he ran into by the late 80s, early 90s, where his style of comedy had adapted to this bigger style comedy that wasn't really linked to an era anymore because Reagan era was gone, and his style just looked weird now because he was making satirical points with stuff that had both kind of moved on from, and he never found a new kind of gear to really go to. So if you look at like his 90s films, like Beverly Hills Cop 3, it's still big and silly in an 80s way. And it's not taking anything seriously, which is a very 80s Landis thing, and it's like moved on from, and it doesn't have a plot that fits into very well with that kind of film, Beverly Hills Cop film. And he was doing stuff that's stupid and things which were, again, too broad. And it was obviously the work of someone who had kind of been left behind by the new system making movies, because at this point indie films were coming up with the Tarantinos and stuff, and he just looked old fashioned. By the time he got to Blues Brothers 2000, it just kind of collapsed, where the musical sequences were fine and the comedy scenes were terrible because he wasn't interested in them anyway, and it was like, you're just doing that bit to please the studios and no one cared about it. So it was a kind of career that did not redefine itself in the 90s to kick up the new gear to actually find a different way of telling the kind of stories. Because if you look at Howard Hawks, he went from decade to decade and he quietly adjusted to whatever was there, but still remained himself. A lot of studio directors did that, and that was probably what Landis was trying to do, was that studio thing, was like, you don't change too much, you still be you, but you just adjust slightly. But some of the Howard Hawks did it a lot better, because he was just better at stories, and more interesting stories than Landis was, who was more of a satirical guy. So he just became broader and broader, Landis. And it became less interesting because he didn't really have a target anymore. But we're going to go back to the 80s, which was much more peak Landis. And even though the films had their problems, they were still fun. I mean, Landis pretty much had a run from Kentucky Fried Movie, which was done also done with the guys at the Airplane. Then you had Animal House, then you had Blues Brothers, then Trading Places, then Into the Night, Spies Like Us, Three Amigos, Coming to America. That's a really good run of films. At the time, they were trash, but when we look back, that's a really good run of films. I mean, there was the Twilight Zone movie in between, which was never finished. It was released, but obviously they couldn't finish that section because the people died, and it was like they tried their best to put it together. And but the polish never been in the film because it was just a reminder of what happened. So the Landis had a good run, so this comes towards the end of the run, these two films, and you can tell they're not as good as like Animal House or Trading Places, or even what followed, which was Coming to America, which is a much stronger film where he was working with people who made sure he took the story seriously a little bit more. So he had a kind of collaborator, even though he was fighting Eddie Murphy, they were collaborating on something and making sure it was right. Like, they both cared about it. So, and it was probably what Landis needed, and what Eddie Murphy needed as well, people to fight with. And if I imagine that film apparently did fight a lot, but it worked for the film. In these two films, Spies Like Us and Three Amigos, he was not originating the stories, but he was brought in as a studio director. But because it's Landis, he put himself into the films. He made the films John Landis films. For good and bad, I have more nostalgia towards Spies Like Us because I saw it in the cinema when I was pretty young. I saw Three Amigos later because it was barely released over a year. I mean, basically, it was a reputation of a bomb straight away, and then it was released and said, "This is a terrible film, don't watch it," and then I saw it in video. So I've seen Spies Like Us more, but I think Three Amigos is better. Really. But they're both films I have an enormous affection for, an enormous memory of from that era. The Spies Like Us is interesting because it's a spy movie and its excesses in the 80s, which was the Bond films had become basically Roger Moore going from place to place and having explosions and doing blame one-liners. There wasn't really spy movies at that era. The spy movies had peaked in the 60s and 70s. Your John Le Carre adaptations, but most of that had gone to TV at a certain point. All the kind of more nuanced spy movies going to TV. Now we did a spy movie, it had to be basically a bit of spying, a lot of action. So Landis had that era to deal with. So he took the spy movie and made it basically a road movie, which was the Bob Hope stuff from the 40s. So he took that idea, two spies who were incompetent, because it didn't really matter, because Bond was pretty incompetent by this point, and all the spies were pretty basic at this point, so he just took it and said, okay, these people are idiots. Which didn't really go against what we're seeing in the real world, because the spies in the real world were doing horrible things in Central America, doing horrible things in the Middle East, and they were dodgy as hell, and no one was going to do a film about that. Unless it was Salvador, which Oliver Stone, which nobody wanted to see. So it was pretty much, don't cover this. This is, this is bad. Do not cover this. We don't want this scene. So the only way to do a spy movie was to make it silly. So Landis made it silly and big, and had lots of silly gags. So he took two incompetents who were Chevy Chase and Dan Aykroyd. Aykroyd's a technical guy who's a genius, and very Aykroyd kind of character, a guy who could just do anything with anything, and he could do all this exposition really quickly and really effectively, and he was a bit naive. So basically he was Ray from Ghostbusters. And Chevy Chase was Chevy Chase, but he's a bumbling narcissist who tried to buy his charm and who was not very bright. So it worked pretty good, because Aykroyd could be the observant one and Chase could be the buffoon. And it pretty much was a wrecking ball metaphor for America. And the funny thing with this film, the thing that makes it work really well, even at the time I noticed this, and it's more obvious as it goes along, is the Russians aren't the bad guys. For the whole film, the Russians are chasing these guys. The films, they're portrayed as the villains. But it's the Americans who are the villains in this film. The Americans have the villain plot. And it's just a crazy cabal of Americans. It's not all the Americans who have this plot. It's just a crazy cabal. And Landis is satirising the intelligence agency with their crazy routines and their crazy ways of doing things, and how everything's just basically in places where no one can figure out what everyone was doing. And so no crazy idea can be stopped in any possible way. And just how nuts the whole thing is. It's definitely like a silly version of Strangelove with lots and lots of silly jokes. It's something that Ishtar would try and do a couple of years later. And Spies Like Us is a more fun version of Ishtar. I like both films, but Spies Like Us is definitely the sillier and funnier one. It gets the humour of the road movies more than Ishtar does. And it does not have a miscast leading man. But again, like Ishtar, it's got that kind of view of the CIA and everything else as, this is dodgy, what's going on, we should not trust these people, this is seriously messed up. So it takes the big silliness and puts on that thing where in the background it's telling you, like, don't trust these people, just don't trust you. We're telling you a silly comedy, but don't trust these people, don't trust the adults. So it's actually a very enjoyable satirical film aimed at 10-year-olds to 15-year-olds who are just there for the jokes. But kind of telling you in the background, don't trust these people. This is not good. That stuff they're doing is not good. Your heroes are actually the villains because they're so stupid. I mean, it's not the level of a Verhoeven and Starship Troopers or anything. But it is funny to see that in a big studio film that made a lot of money. Because it was a success. It was a big success. And basically, everyone came out well. It did not do well critically, but it was probably the only film that Aykroyd made beyond Ghostbusters in that era that actually was successful. And there was another Chevy Chase film that did well before his career collapsed. That just went off the mountain pretty quickly after this film. But it is a big silly film. It is paceless though. I mean, basically, it stops and starts a lot. There's a training sequence which is terrific and silly. Then they go to Afghanistan, which is a bizarre thing for a movie. The Russians are in Afghanistan. Let's go to Afghanistan. at least in the plot, and have silly gags with these doctors and things like that, and have the silliest gags ever in Afghanistan. Which is just ridiculous but wonderful at the same time, as they're taking the most serious places and just making it ridiculous. Which is one of the things I liked about the film at the time. I still like the film. It's just, they go to Afghanistan and then they go into Russia, and the most serious places, and it turns out, even though the Russians are villains in their own way, they're not villains in the film. They're not doing anything wrong in this film. It's just a crazy American and all their stupid ideas. Which is what Landis has, is an appreciation of how dumb his country is, and how ridiculous his own country is. Which is the big thing that I always liked for Landis as a kid. Really was. It was like one of the early directors, like Richard Lester, and then later on Verhoeven, who were just saying, don't trust these grown-ups. They're stupid. They're really stupid. So he was a great gateway drug, to that kind of stuff. That's why a lot of studios don't like the directors putting themselves into films, putting their personality into films, because they can be putting stuff in that the studios don't agree with. And you can have one silly comedy that seems to be saying one thing, and then you're watching the film and it's really saying the exact opposite. It's a spy movie where your heroes are working for the villains, and they don't know it because they're so dumb. And it tells you, yeah, they're really that stupid. Like, the spies don't think about what they're doing or why they're doing it. Which is pretty much what happens in any country. It's not just America, it's every country like that. It's totally accurate with that bit. It's like the spies do things and they're not thinking about the consequences. They're just doing their job. And their job is dubious. But it's the way the world works. Every country has this. So then we go to Three Amigos, which is another film about stupid Americans abroad. And this started with Steve Martin. He had this idea about these silent film stars who lose their jobs in the studio and end up being in a Magnificent Seven type scenario. We'd have to go and save this Mexican village from these Mexican, warlords. Now, basically, this is a film that, if any film that's ripped off Seven Samurai, this is my favourite, because it's ripping off Magnificent Seven, which ripped off Seven Samurai, or was an official remake of. But this film's way more fun than this Magnificent Seven, at least for me it is. It's very enjoyable. It's really silly. And again, like Spies Like Us, it's big and ridiculous and just does whatever the hell it wants to do. It's just so silly and just so utterly, try to care about try to get the critics to love it. It was not about plot. Again, it meanders. There's Landis was never the tightest editor of his material. He is a filmmaker who lets his films stretch out because the jokes are there. So he's making it for a theatrical experience. And sometimes you can have cut it down a bit more. So the film really is about stupidity amidst a serious situation. So these villagers don't have a clue. They are poor farmers who don't have a clue about anything, just like in Seven Samurai. So they see these Three Amigos, which are movies shown in a local church. And because they're getting terrorized by these warlords, they decide to write to Hollywood to the Three Amigos because they think the Three Amigos are actually, proper fighters and not just pampered, stupid actors. So the Three Amigos are Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, and Martin Short. And it's a very good mix of actors, actually, because Steve Martin in that era was quite a cold comedian. Is like his persona was standoffish, and this was probably one of the first films where he was actually a bit, because he was working with Martin Short and Chevy Chase, he was a bit warmer. And Landis, he actually credited Landis for that, even though he didn't like Landis's direction of the film when the film came out. He seems to have warmed to it a lot more since then. He did credit Landis with making it sweeter than he expected. And Chase is actually playing a guy who's actually kind of naive in lots of ways. He thinks he's smart, but he's not really. He thinks he's Chevy Chase in Spies Like Us, and he's even dumber than the character in Spies Like Us. He really is naive and silly and, not worldly, even if he really tries to be. So it's probably one of his sweetest performances. And Martin Short's wonderful. Martin Short's always good, but he was never a movie star, but he's always someone who is always good in films. And here he plays Ned, who's the small one of the group, who's the more naive one. He's the former child star who's now in the Three Amigos, but he used to have his own series. And he's just this wonderfully gormless feeling of someone who just wanders through the world not getting it at all. And basically they're all three of them are pampered, and when they go too far with their movie studio boss, played by Joe Mantegna, they get thrown off the lot and they lose all their clothes and everything, and they're out in their ear, and it's like, okay, what do we do now? And that's when they get the telegram saying, please come to Mexico to do a show. What they don't realise is it's a real show, and they just go and they steal back their costumes from the studio lot, and they go to Mexico and way over their heads. It's just as silly as it sounds. It's one of those films that costs a lot of money. It looks great. They spent a lot of money on it, and it was a film that no one who was making it thought of, who's this film for? Because the film was for people who were going to enjoy it on TV 3 or 4 years later. It was not for the audience they released it to. The audience they released it to didn't get it. It was like, very much like Blade Runner, the Thing, or something like that, where it was like an 80s film where the 80s audience was like, or Big Trouble in Little China. It's a probably more accurate thing, where the audience just went, what the hell is this? And the future people got it straight away, because it's like, this was the Reaganite 80s where Might won, and this one it was like these three idiots don't have a clue, and these are your heroes. Again, it's a political thing in the 80s where Landis portraying people as stupid. Your heroes are stupid, which did not help in the 80s. It really did not help for the box office. But it helps a lot in the film because it can take the cliches of this genre and don't take them seriously, where everything is subverted, where not only are the heroes, normally in these kind of adventure stories, the heroes are kicked down about halfway through so they can stand back up and show their manhood. In this one, they deserve to get kicked down. They are stupid. They do not have a clue. They are doing musical numbers and big Mexican bars with all these killers in it, which is a wonderful scene, but it's like, they deserve what they get. They have to do a pilgrimage through the desert to find the singing bush that keeps on singing and doesn't give them any information. They have to deal with an invisible cowboy who they accidentally shoot. That's the kind of film it is. It's really silly. They've got fake backdrops that are obviously fake and intentionally obviously fake. You have singing tortoises. It's insane. The film's wonderfully insane. It's like it's got everything's quotation marks. Even at the end, when they succeed and beat the villains, they succeed in the most intentionally stupid way possible, where everybody sews close to look like Amigos, so no one can tell where they're shooting from. So it lets the townspeople feel like Amigos at the same time, so they can help the townspeople fight back against these criminals. And at least my favourite line in the film, so like the wind. It's really silly. And the reason why the villains don't kill them halfway through is like, I will only kill men. These three are not men. It's just ridiculous film. Which is wonderful. But it's completely not what was wanted at the time. This film came out not long. I think it was the same year as Big Trouble in Little China, another film with exactly the same idea. There's obviously directors who looked at Reagan era and thought, I don't like this. Let's take the piss out of it. And they both bombed, but both films that came out later became very influential. So, it's wonderful. And really silly. There's some great stuff like Martin Short telling a story to all these villagers, and it's a story of how Mary-ish, the sister of Lillian Gish, who they don't have a clue who this is, told him, "You've got it. You have it. Star power." And it's wonderfully ridiculous stuff. And Chevy Chase with a guitar is hilarious in this film because he's just so silly, he's so clueless. And the whole thing is about some girl trying to get me to kiss her is wonderful, just silly as hell. And it really humanises him in a lot of ways. It's probably one of his most human performance. And it's just one of those films that just works, even though it's made for nobody. It's made for the people who are making the film. They like it, and then other people got it and they liked it. But it's a film that found its audience later, but it was not there at the time. But again, it's these kind of films floated through the VHS scene and cable scene and everything else. The Spies Like Us and Three Amigos, they were released and you saw them in cinema, but the real market was in the home later. People were talking about them and talking about them in school, and there were these kind of satirical films that people understood were taking the piss out of what you might take seriously. And that's important when you're living through a hellish 80s conformist nightmare. You need films like that to get you through, or Robocop, or stuff like that, or just say, this stuff's nonsense. This stuff's ridiculous. So that's what I really remember about these films, is they were just big fun films that suited me at the time for my intellectual capabilities at, 10 to 12 or 13 or something like that, where, you knew a bit but you didn't know that much, so you were learning what satire was. And these films, even though they were silly, were important things to me to actually learn, oh, that's another way to look at the world, without telling you, like, you must think this way. It's just like, no, these are silly comedies with pratfalls, but also they're satirical. They are saying the heroes are stupid. So I hope you enjoyed this weird extended video about two silly films. Hope it interested you, and I'll be back later with another video. Right, bye for now.